Okay, so let's get organized here and get started sewing our front panels. If we are going to be using a top stitching thread, I think this makes the whole jacket just look really professional and nice, so I would recommend using the top stitch thread. But what you want to do then is put the top stitch thread into your machine now, thread it, and then with a regular all-purpose thread in your bobbin. So go ahead and thread everything in your machine. And also something that you might want to key into is when you're top stitching, you may want to lengthen your stitch length. So if your standard stitch length on your machine is like 2 inches, that's what you're kind of used to using, then you might want to lengthen that out to a bit longer. But go ahead and put that denim needle in your machine and put your walking foot on if you have one, and go ahead and thread that top stitching thread into your machine and wind your bobbin. Once you've done all that, let's just grab I'm gonna set some of these other threads aside for now, and I'm gonna find the pattern pieces that we need. So we need the front panels, front side pieces, and the front middle pieces are what we're looking for. So this front middle, grab that, and front side, grab that. Everything else can get put to the side for now, and we'll come back to it. So we have our front side and our front middle pieces here. All right, so if you're using a serger, the instructions are a little bit different. Generally what you're gonna be doing is you're gonna be stitching the front side pieces to the front middle pieces with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. You're gonna serge them, and then you're gonna press it towards one of the front side pieces. And then you can top stitch that in place if you would like it to look like a flat felled seam, you can do it that way, and then repeat for the other pieces. But what we're gonna be doing are flat felled seams in a more traditional style without the use of the serger for this tutorial. So if you would like to follow along with that, that's what I'll be doing. If you've never done a flat fell seam, don't worry. It's not going to be that complicated, and by the end, you are going to be a pro at it. But what's important with flat fell seams is that which piece you have on top when you're stitching is the piece that's going to show, with the top stitching onto it. So we want to just make sure that we are mindful of which piece we have facing which way, so that everything lines up, and the top stitching and everything with the flat felled seam is how we want it to look. So what we're going to do is stitch with the front middle piece on top using a 5/8 seam allowance. So we're gonna first line up the pair of the front side and the middle pieces, the front middle pieces, that will be on the left side of the garment. And if you're not sure, you can always grab the piece and hold it up to yourself. So that's gonna be this one, and this one. Okay, so we're gonna place them with the wrong sides together. And we want the front middle piece to be on top using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So this is the front middle piece. We want it to be on top. And we're gonna grab our pins or our clips, whatever you have. If you have Wonder clips, that's fine. And what you're gonna notice is there's a slight curvature to this front side piece. So we wanna ease our straight piece into the curve, which may just require you to have more pins than usual. Just pin as much as you need to make these pieces fit together. So your front middle piece should be on top. And now, using a 5/8 inch seam allowance, we're going to stitch this side of the garment at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. We can also go ahead and grab our other front side and front middle pieces, put the wrong sides together on them, and ease them together as well. It doesn't really matter which side panel you start with, left or right. You just want to make sure that you have things lined up properly for the flat fell seam. So let's go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch this at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, just a few little things before we start sewing. If you haven't lengthened your stitch length, just ever so slightly, you might want to. My default stitch length is 2.5, so I've just lengthened it out to a 3, but you could do it to a 2.8 or whatever. And then you'll want to make sure you have your needle in there and your top stitch thread and everything. And then you'll also want to make sure that you are top stitching on top of the middle piece with the middle piece up here. And we are going to do this at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So that's a little bit wider than our usual seam allowance, but that's okay. This is great. So also, one other thing, when you are top stitching or you're using top stitching thread, it is a bit thicker than regular thread. So if you have trouble with back stitching, some machines have trouble with back stitching. You don't have to back stitch on either side. Flat fell seams often have 2 rows of stitching that hold them together, so back stitching can be skipped for most seams, and instead what you'll just want to do is leave a small tail of thread at either end to kind of stop any unraveling from happening while you complete the rest of the garment. But if you can't back stitch, it's not a problem. It should not be an issue at all. Okay, so let's go ahead and stitch. So you should have a really lovely top stitch here. All right, so now to continue with your flat felt seams, what you need to do is trim the front side seam allowance in half. So we stitched with the front middle piece up, but now what we want to do is flip it over so that the front side piece is on top, that piece that has that curvature on it. And now we're going to trim the seam allowance in half. Don't trim the front seam, front middle piece at all. So we're just gonna trim through this layer on the front side piece in half, just the one layer. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that with your dressmaking shears or your bigger sewing scissors, grab a pair of tiny scissors that you can use that will prevent you from cutting through things and stitch with them. A little stork embroidery scissor or something like that is a great option to prevent cutting through too much. So we're cutting this front side seam allowance in half. Sorry if the camera angle isn't the best. Just trying to show you without having to reposition my camera too much here. Once we've trimmed that down and in half, you should be left with a piece that kind of sticks out, and that should be the front middle piece, and it should be longer. Okay, so now what we need to do is press the seam open. And once we've pressed this seam open, we're going to press everything down towards the front side so that the shorter part of the seam is hidden underneath and the top part is going to be hidden over. So it's going to be folded over and tucked under, and it's going to look like that. So let's go over to my iron and pressing mat and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so what we've done so far, it'll be much easier to see than what I was doing by my sewing machine over there. We've sewn the front side and the middle front pieces together. We've done like a nice little top stitch and we've trimmed the seam allowance in half. I am going to trim this a little bit nicer. Okay, there we go. So if you have repeated the process for the other front side piece, then you'll want to do the same. You'll want to trim. Piece you want to trim is the curved piece. You want to trim that in half, that seam allowance in half as well. Okay, now once our iron has been heated up, you're going to fold and press the seam towards the front side piece so that the shorter part of the seam is hidden underneath. So let's open this up. And we want to hide that short part. So we're really going to press this, press these pieces down, okay? You might need to pull your fabric just a little bit. Get a good solid press of it. Okay, and repeat for the other side. Press the short side down. So I'm pressing towards me. Okay, once we've done that, we're going to fold the longer side of the seam allowance in half, and the raw edge will just tuck under. Let me zoom in a little bit here because I think it's hard to see with the color of denim I have. All right, so I've got my short side now facing you guys. But see this raw long edge? We want to fold this raw long edge under so that it's tucked under here and tucked into the seam, never to be seen again. And once we've tucked it, we're going to give it a really nice press, really nice solid press, and that's going to hold that seam in place. Okay, be nice and crisp. You shouldn't see any raw edges anymore. You can see the part where I've pressed versus the part that I haven't pressed down. And for good measure, if you need to, you can stick a couple of pins in here just to hold it even further down. Hold it in place. But we will be stitching again. We're going to be doing another top stitching on this flat filled seam. We're going to continue pressing the seam down. And I've just flipped my pattern piece again because I wasn't really, I was kind of struggling to see it. From the angle I was at. Gonna stick a pin in this though. And if maybe you didn't trim enough out of that first part of the seam allowance when you did the trimming, go back and trim a little more. It's quite all right if you have to go back and trim a little bit more to make this work nicely. And if you want to, you know, throw a couple pins in. Now, we should have this whole seam, I'm gonna zoom out again, pinned. And what we'll do is we will actually stitch down this seam again, another top stitch to enclose this part where I have it pinned. And that's gonna be approximately 1/8 inch away from the folded edge. And that will be the flat fell seam process. But what we need to do is do this again for the other front pieces, front, middle, and front side pieces. To enclose that raw edge. And if you have really dark denim, it's probably going to come off on your fingers a little bit. Or if you have, you know, really dyed denim, I should say. I am noticing some bleeding here onto my fingers. They'll probably be like a dark blue color at the end of this sew along. Bear with me if I look like a blue person, a smurf. I'm just gonna stab a few pins in here for good measure to hold my seam down. If you don't want to pin, you don't have to. This is not required. It just makes sure that the seam, the raw edges and everything are tucked under when you do that top stitching. And it's just kind of nice to have that guarantee that, you know, you're not gonna have little raw edges sticking out of the seam. Okay, so let's go over to the machine again and top stitch at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, we're doing the final process in the flat fell seam for the front and side panel parts. All right, so the folded edge that we've ironed and pressed down, we're going to stitch at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way down. Back stitch if you're able, if not, no worries. All right, and you should have a really lovely flat fell seam, and it should be 2 rows. Congratulations, you've just finished flat fell seams, and you will need to do this process throughout the Kingston as you make it. So just make sure that you come back to this video and watch it, watch how to do the whole flat felled seam process again if you need to. Yay, you've done your first set of flat felled seams. What we're going to do is now do another flat felled seam to join the front edge piece section that we've just created with the front middle piece that we are going to be attaching. So what we need to do is grab the front left and front right pieces of our pattern. Okay, so that stuff goes with the right, this stuff goes with the left. And we are going to be placing the pieces wrong sides together again. And we need to ease them in and pin them in place. Just as we did before for the first part. You can use clips if you prefer. Now we are going to be stitching this, and then at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then we're going to trim the side front edge piece in half. We don't want to trim the front middle piece, so that's this piece we've already stitched the one side on. We want to, after we stitch, we want to trim this piece, and then we're going to press to the one side and we're going to top stitch. Okay, let's make this flat fell seam. Okay, so I've just stitched the first part of the flat felled seam. Now what we need to do is trim this side of the seam allowance. So that's the side that is the front left. I'm going to be trimming down the front left seam allowance, not the middle piece. Now you're going to press to the side and fold it over, and then we're going to top stitch it 1/8 of an inch down. And then after we're done with all that, we're going to repeat for the right front side. So we've just finished the front pieces for the right and the left parts of the jacket. You should have your pattern markings for your pocket if you are doing a front pocket. And we're going to be moving on to the pocket part. So hopefully you're finding flat felled seams to be pretty straightforward now that you know how to do them. I really think they're fun. I like making flat felled seams, so hopefully you're enjoying that because we got a lot more of those coming. Okay, so what you want to do is fire up your iron if you don't currently have it on, and we want to just get that heating because we're going to do some pressing on this next step. Also, make sure that you have your pockets handy for this next portion, okay? So I'm gonna go grab my iron, get it heated up, and we'll come back and do some pressing. I've got my iron on and we're ready to press. So grab a seam gauge or a ruler as well. Set it to 1/4 inch right now. And then what we're going to do is fold the top edge of each one of our pockets down, and we're going to press it down by 1/4 inch. Going to do the same thing for the other pocket. 1/4 inch press. Now, if you have a seam gauge, extend that out to a 3/4 inch seam allowance. And we're going to turn this top edge on both of the pockets over by 3/4 inch now. And press. And then we're going to repeat for the other pocket. All right, once we've pressed these, if you need to, grab a clip or a pen to just hold this down. If you're having issues with it staying completely flat, just clipping it on the ends here. What we're going to do next is we're going to turn over each pocket piece, and we're going to top stitch along the folded edge here of the pocket at approximately 1/8 of an inch from the edge. So the top edge about 1/8 of an inch. And then we're going to do a second line of stitching further down, another top stitch here, But this second line is going to be approximately a 1/2 inch away from the top of the pocket. So we're going to take care of that. I'm not going to show you that part of sewing just because it is a straight stitch. It's just top stitching with your top stitch thread. And then we'll come back and we'll do a little bit more ironing. So make sure you keep your iron on. We're back. We've done our top stitching, 2 rows. And now what we need to do is fold the side seam allowances of each pocket under by approximately 5/8 of an inch. So we're going to do that, and we're going to press as well. So we're going to do it on all the sides. Let's flip these over. We're going to do the sides, and the bottom. 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and we'll take care of that right now. So if you need to move your seam gauge out to 5/8, do that now. This will make our pocket a lot smaller. Giving things a good press, a good old press. Okay, once we've pressed our pocket, we can open up the seam allowances and we can actually give them a trim to approximately half the width that they were. It's not necessary to do this, but it does mean that the raw edge of the seam allowance will get caught between the 2 rows of the top stitching. So, if we don't trim the seam allowances, then you'll have like little frayed bits eventually in your pockets. So that's kind of why we're doing this step. Prevent the frayed bits. Okay, and then I'm going to give everything another good press now that it's been trimmed. Just to make sure it still holds the pressing that I gave it before. Okay, do it for the other side, the other pocket as well. I might actually just pop a little clip there for right now to hold these iron placements that I just made. Okay, and we're going to give it a trim like we just did on the other side pocket. And we can stick a little clip in it if we need to hold it down. We can also give it another good press if we need to. So we should have 2 really nice little looking pressed pockets. What we need to do is grab our front middle pieces now. We can remove the iron. So grab our pocket, our front pieces. And we're going to measure 1 inch down from the top of our front middle piece, and we're gonna mark it with a pin. If you have that seam gauge handy, set it to 1 inch, mark it straight down from the center. There's 1 inch down marked horizontally with a pin. And from there, we need to pin our pockets to the front here. So we want to make sure the top of the pocket aligns with the pin that we just placed. And we also want to make sure that our pattern markings that we have here and that I've done in chalk are aligned as well. So this pocket's getting centered over the flat fell seams that we did to start. It's centered over the middle piece of the front. If you are doing a bit of a smaller size, the pocket aligns, you know, with the seams between the front and the side middle, you know, very similar to what you're seeing with mine. It's lining up right on the seams. For larger sizes, the pocket won't align perfectly, so you really want to make sure that you line it up over the pattern marking that you have from the very beginning. So we're going to sew 2 more rows of top stitching around the pocket to secure it now. And we're gonna do a little diagonal to affix the pocket, to kind of hold the pocket down even more in place. So we wanna take care of all of that. If you need to, which I would recommend doing this, pin your pocket down so that it stays in place when you go to stitch. And if you've got clips and, you know, you can remove them. The clips were really mainly there just to hold the ironed pressed pieces down. But now that you've got pins in place around the pocket, you don't really need them quite so much anymore. So what we're going to do is stitch around the pocket at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go all the way around and do that small little diagonal. We're going to do a small diagonal in here, like right along here and right along here. And then from there, we're going to stitch a little bit wider, another top stitching layer, a 1/2 inch out from the pocket edge. I'm over at my machine planning to stitch on my pockets to the front. So we're going to start with that 1/8 of an inch all the way around the outside seam allowance, top stitching. Okay, and remember when you come to the end of the pocket, the top of the pocket, you want to lift your presser foot, pivot, and we're going to do just a quick little diagonal line that goes down from the point into the pocket area. That just kind of reinforces things. All right, so we also need to do it on the other side as well. Okay, and we also want to just make sure that we do the second row of top stitching, and that is for the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now let's go around this again, 1/2 inch seam allowance, and do a little bit more stitching. All right, and you should have one beautifully top stitched pocket. Now go ahead and repeat that for the other side. Great job, you've just sewn on 2 beautiful pockets. So the top stitching, hopefully you're happy with that. I know I'm happy with mine. What we're going to do in this next part is ultimately sew the front yoke onto the jacket. But if we are doing the pocket option like we just have started doing here, we now need to take care of doing the flap first, and then we'll move into the front yoke portion of this sew along. So what I would recommend doing, if you are not sewing the pocket, you can move on to the front yoke steps in this video, or in this section of videos, I should say. But if you are doing the pocket, then stick along. You're right at the perfect part here for us. So grab your pocket flaps. You should have 4 total pieces of flaps. And as I mentioned earlier, I was doing mine with like a little contrast on the underside of the flap, so I have 2 and 2. What we need to do is place the 2 pairs of pocket flaps, but we need to take our right sides and put them together. So if you have all 4 denim pieces for your flaps, that's fine too. But if you have the contrast, that's what they'll look like. And then you can clip or pin them together. And now what we're going to do is stitch around these pieces at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, but we're going to leave the tops open here, the top of the flap open. You don't have to use top stitching thread for this step, just use regular thread. Save that top stitching thread for the top stitching parts so that you don't waste it. I know it's a little bit more expensive, pricey. So let's go stitch and we'll come back. I'm not actually going to show you the stitching portion either, just because it is very straightforward. We're just doing all the way around on each side of this flap. All right, so I've just stitched around these pocket flaps, and now what we need to do is just clip our seam allowance in half. And this will just allow us to turn our pocket flaps out and reduce seam bulk. Okay, do that for both pockets. Okay, now we can turn our pocket flaps out to the right sides, and then we're going to press them down. And actually, I can grab my pressing mat here again. Fire up my iron, get it warming up again. And if you have like a little pokey stick or something, knitting needle works really great. Just poke out the pocket corners. You get a nice crisp corner. Okay, and we're gonna press them down. Can you guess what we're gonna be doing next? I'm just imagining somebody here saying top stitching, and if you've said top stitching, then you're absolutely right. That's what we're gonna be doing next. You're getting the point here. So, if you still have some corners that you want to like push out a little bit now that you've pressed, go ahead and push them out. Okay, so what are we gonna top stitch? We're gonna top stitch around the outside here. So we're gonna stitch all the way along the outside. We're gonna leave the pocket flap top parts open. But the first set of stitching is gonna be 1/8 inch around the outside, 1/8 inch seam allowance. The second set is going to be at the 1/2 inch seam allowance as well. And also, if we are doing buttons, buttonholes, snaps, whatever we're doing, we might want to take a moment to mark where we want the buttonhole to go, or hopefully you already marked it before you started this process, but you can go ahead and put the buttonhole in the top of the pocket flap here, if that's the way you're going to be doing it, or go ahead and put the snap in, whatever you're doing, because later on putting a buttonhole in there is going to be rather tricky. So go do the top stitching and your button or snap. So I actually misspoke in the end of that last video. If you're doing the snaps option, don't add the snap right now. You can do it later. It's only if you're doing the button and buttonhole option that you want to make sure you add your buttonholes to the flaps, because it'll be really hard if you don't do them now. It'll be harder to do them later. Okay, so now what we want to do with our wrong sides together, we're going to pick up our front yoke and the matching front piece. So grab your flaps, you can set them aside for now. And grab your front yokes then. So you should have a left front yoke and a right front yoke. Okay, and you're going to need them for this next step. I'm gonna actually zoom out a little bit here so you can see more of my table. So you just wanna make sure you have the right pieces. You can hold up your pattern pieces to yourself if you need to, but that is the left side as worn. This is the right side as worn. And as long as you know that, you should be good. Okay, so with our wrong sides together, we want to stitch the front yoke to the front piece. And we're stitching with the front yoke being on top. And you should have some notches based on the pattern markings. Those should be aligning with your flat fell seams in the front. So clipper pin these pieces together in place, wrongs together. I need to slide this over just a tiny hair to get it to align a little bit better. There we go. Repeat this for the other side. Okay, now what we need to do is stitch the front yoke together with the front yoke on top. Okay, and then we need to trim the seam allowance of the front piece in half, as we normally would for the flat felt seam. So let's go ahead and do that right now, and we'll come back and we'll trim, the flat felt seam together and go from there. But the first line of top stitching, you guys can handle on your own because you are professionals. Okay, so I've just top stitched along the yoke side of the front left and right yokes. Okay, what we need to do now is we will need to cut our seam allowance in half on the bottom half, not the yoke part, but the bottom half of the front. The top half is the half that we're going to be folding over and making the beautiful flat felt seam with. So we need to make sure that we trim the bottom and not the top of the yoke here. So I can go ahead and start doing that now. And same goes for this side. All right, so let's trim the bottom portion of the front. But too thick for those dainty scissors. Now we need to press everything. So I think the easiest way to press is to start with the back of the jacket and to kind of press everything in that crease. Kind of press everything upward towards the yoke. Okay, next we're going to be pressing everything down in the direction of the bottom, because eventually we're going to fold this over and finish the flat felt seam. And do the same thing for the other side as well. Press it flat first and then flip it. Then press everything down. Okay, so now we need to grab our pocket flaps again, and we're gonna grab our pocket flaps and we're going to trim the top of one of them by 3/8 of an inch. So set your seam gauge to 3/8 of an inch and trim across it. If you find it easiest to grab a piece of chalk, tailor's chalk, or something to make a line, you may do that, as I do find it kind of helps to have a line to go with. And then trim it that 3/8 off the top. Now you're going to line the pocket flap up with the right side up, centered over our pocket, our actual pocket here. And we want to slip the raw edge as far up under the seam allowance here as possible, as we possibly can. Now we're going to turn our longer flat felt seam over the top of the pocket flap. Tucking in all the raw edges. We can also pin and press this down. We'll need to pin and press it down. It's going to be really bulky in this part under the pocket and under the pocket flap. And it's just going to pop open. So okay, and you know the drill. We need to just do another line of top stitching along this edge that we've pinned. Go slowly, especially if you don't have a walking foot. You may want to consider putting a different foot on your machine than just the normal one that you use. Sometimes zipper foots give you a little extra glide, when you're dealing with really thick fabrics and things like that. So maybe consider putting a zipper foot on or a Teflon coated foot, something. But it is going to be really thick for you to try to sew through all these layers with the pocket flap, and even just flat felt seams. So go slow, It'll be okay. You'll be able to do it. Finish out that flat fell seam. And then repeat for the other side, front yoke. Congratulations! You've just finished the fronts of the yokes and the pockets and everything. Hopefully you're liking what you have. The next part we will be moving on to is the back.